shot. But anyways, I think you guys are ready. I am certainly ready. I still haven't caught COVID. Dude, that's so cool, bro.
With a few simple clicks, you can change your IP and access foreign sites and media that you would usually not have access to, or to just hide your IP from any sites or persons that may be trying
Okay, so if you guys are listening,
no logs are
good
kept.
or
There's
bad,
an
you know,
app
tell me.
version that works with a whole host of different platforms, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee if you are not satisfied.
There we go.
Newly added is internet.
Oh boy, I'm excited, dude!
/kraut and
yes,
use the
it's been 6 months.
83%
6 months since we have watched a video of my man Kraut.
That's surfshark.deals.
You know, forget about being gay or straight or whatever, right? I am Kraut sexual. You know, that's my sexuality. Kraut sexual, dude. The Folly of Liberal History. There we go.
There is this story you probably heard.
It's a bit quiet.
English school kid of the English barons ruled by the incompetent King John, who forced the king into signing the Magna Carta.
That should be better.
Document, a concession
a little
by
better.
The king to the rights of the barons, supposedly formed the foundation from which English democracy and Anglo-American democracy in general was born. The Magna Carta holds an almost mythical and sacred position within the English-speaking political consciousness, the supposed foundation from which English liberty was unleashed upon the world and Britain came to prosper. There is, however, a problem with this narrative. 7 years after the signing of the Magna Carta...
Okay, so we're talking about the Magna Carta, but let me just raise the volume a little bit. 40, there we go. That should be better. Not quite 6 months, he made a video after the invasion of Ukraine. I think you're right. I mean, wasn't that... Yeah, no, you're right. He did make a video about... Yeah, that's true. 3 months, sorry. Yeah, no. And he actually made a video after... Yeah. So 3 months, you know, it's still...
In 1222, King Andras II of Hungary was forced to sign the Golden Bull. The Golden Bull is sometimes called the Magna Carta of Eastern Europe, but it was far more extensive in the rights and privileges that it entitled the Hungarian aristocracy to. Hungary and England basically had the same starting position in political development. But in the coming centuries, there was no Hungarian democracy and no ideal of Hungarian liberty that evolved from the Golden Bull. Instead, the Kingdom of Hungary decayed, lost power and influence, and was eventually conquered by the Ottomans. Some may blame this decay on the Mongol invasion, but this conveniently ignores the less famous Second Mongol invasion, in which the Hungarians decisively defeated the Mongols and kicked them out of Hungary. No, the reason for the decline of the Hungarian kingdom actually is the Golden Bull.
Huh. Okay.
The Hungarians were a nomadic people originating from the southern Urals, near the modern Russian-Kazakhstani border. 7 Hungarian tribes invaded Europe in the 9th century, conquered the Pannonian Basin, and used it as a base for
I love the
they
background
spent the next
sound.
100 years invading, plundering, and raiding the Balkans, Greece, Germany, Italy, France, and even as far as Spain. The century known as the Hungarian invasions, and what the Germans call Ungarnkriege, didn't end until the Holy Roman Empire defeated the Hungarian warhordes at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, kicking the Hungarians out of the Holy Roman Empire and confining them to a sphere of influence that contained...
His music choice is always good. Bro,
By the
that's
10th
so
century,
true.
the most powerful of the 7 Hungarian tribes, the Magyari, founded the Árpád dynasty, converted to Christianity, and turned the sphere of influence in the Balkans into the Kingdom of Hungary. Just as in most of Europe, warlords became aristocrats and kings, ruling over peasantry in a decentralized system of feudalism. Just like in the rest of Europe, communal lands became the property of the king, who then handed them out to aristocrats, forming the foundation of a power struggle between the king and the aristocracy. With the aristocracy gaining more estates and power, both the Hungarian and English kings were forced to sign concessions into 2 constitutional documents. There is, however, a key difference between the two. In England, the barons wished to extend their privileges and therefore forced the Magna Carta. In contrast, in Hungary, it was the royal army and the church who forced the Golden Bull to protect themselves from the barons. The Hungarian king had already been so weakened by the power the aristocracy had gained through the acquisition of estates that the army feared its own position of power. And the church in Hungary feared that the aristocracy would come for its estates and also wanted to drive out the Jews and Muslims that many Hungarian aristocrats tolerated in their lands. The fact that there were 30 Muslim villages in 12th century Hungary, as well as large Jewish communities who were not only tolerated
30.
while the rest of Europe was consumed
That's
by
quite a
religious
lot,
zealotry
isn't
and
it?
intolerance,
30
but also
Muslim
protected when
villages.
foreign crusaders marched through Hungary on their way to Jerusalem shows just how decentralized political structures were at the time and just how powerful the regional Hungarian aristocrats were. The Hungarian state was even further weakened by the first Mongol invasion, which destroyed the army and occupied the country. Lucky for Hungary, the Mongols left after only a few years because the Great Khan died. So they had to return to the steppes to pay tribute and elect a new Great Khan. Out of fear of a Mongol return, the Hungarians rebuilt an army that successfully defeated the Mongols. However, that army was never incorporated into the state.
Pretty cool to think that, such a big and vast empire, but the Mongols, there weren't a lot of Mongols. I mean, talking numerically. So just sending a bunch of people through such a vast empire just wasn't feasible. And then you add that the Khan died, and of course they had to go pay tribute.
The centralized Hungarian state was thereby completely weakened. The Hungarian aristocracy had no military or state obligations of service towards the king. An early parliament created by the aristocracy had so much power that the Hungarian king basically became little less than a powerless figurehead. The Hungarian aristocratic assembly even gave themselves the power to imprison the king for the welfare of the kingdom should he threaten such. Although Hungary was a centralized kingdom in name, it was basically reduced to little more than a confederacy of oligarchic barons by the 14th century. Then came the Turks. With the advancing of the Ottomans into the Balkans during the 15th century, the Hungarian state briefly rebounded. János Hunyadi, an aristocratic military leader, was made regent of the state, raised taxes, and formed what became known as the Black Army, which inflicted several defeats on the Ottomans, even kicking them out of Serbia at one point. The Hungarian Black Army managed to protect Hungary and for 50 years was basically the only thing stopping the Ottomans from just rolling into Europe. Fascinating topic. However, there are military history YouTubers who can probably cover this better. For us, what matters is that for all of its successes, rather than cementing the necessity of a centralized state, the Hungarian aristocracy resented and hated the Black Army.
Exactly, yeah. There are also massive supply issues when most Mongols live in China and Central Asia. Oh yeah, for sure.
They hated its successes, they hated its commander, they hated the fact that they had to pay taxes for it, and they resented that they had to give up their own military privileges. They hated the centralized government structures needed to sustain it. So, by 1490, they called a parliament and voted to reinstate their own military privileges.
John Hunyadi, well, what he said, is a very famous crusader.
Boy king on the throne, and to add a cherry on top, they cut the taxes levied on them by 80%. 4 years later, the Ottomans invaded Hungary, crushed what was left of the Black Army, killed the boy king, and conquered all of Hungary. The Hungarian aristocratic oligarchy basically destroyed their own country.
Exactly, yeah, for sure. Because, I mean, you're cutting the taxes that you pay. Of course, that's great for you, but how are you going to fund your army, And of course, the Ottomans would invade. So, they didn't seem to learn a lot from the Mongol invasion. They became even worse. So, not great, but whatever.
Whig history is the idea that liberal democracy...
Hunyadi is also a key part of the story of Dracula. Wow, blood
throughout history. It's an idea originating in England and basically claims that liberty is a concept invented by the Greeks, inherited to Rome, continued in spirit in Anglo-Saxon Britain, reinvigorated by...
Isn't it funny that a lot of people, a lot of European countries follow... they do follow a lot of what the Romans did, but they do feel like successors of Rome. I'm sure there's a lot of countries that say that or claim that.
Examined by Cromwell and ultimately triumphantly reborn through the Glorious Revolution, culminating in the Enlightenment and American Revolution.
In America...
I'm admittedly paraphrasing this summary in a rather uncharitable way because I find the idea ridiculous. But as ridiculous as I may make it sound, I would not be surprised if you have encountered it yourself. The idea that liberal democracy or liberalism is unavoidable, a human force of desire for freedom so powerful it will eventually overcome all odds to establish itself. that there is a specific set of political developments and stages societies undergo to achieve a liberal democratic framework.
I don't really think there are any countries today that claim to be successors. Well, yeah, I think I used the wrong words, you know, not successor per se, like little successors.
It's a seductive
but
idea,
you know
very
what,
similar to great man history, and rebranded into a sort of great
I just don't know what to,
but it is ultimately wrong.
How to
on this channel I have critiqued Marxist and nationalist narratives of history, but I have also
by the way, the animation and just the country balls themselves, I think they have gotten a lot better, don't you guys think? I mean, just the quality of the, like I said, the animation has gotten like a huge improvement.
Namely, every time.
I mean, they've always been good. Don't get me wrong. Like, they've always been really good.
I find this to be one of the greatest flaws of liberal narratives of history, and I say this as a liberal myself. The seductive tendency to craft a narrative of freedom that places events, almost like Marx did with social classes, as necessary components in a development to liberal democracy. Because just as with Marxism, the historical record simply proves this wrong. Medieval Hungary and England both had the same political starting positions of decentralized, constitutionally limited power, but they both went entirely different directions. The English king managed to retain enough power to build a semi-centralized
the least stable
state,
country of them all,
in a political struggle over compromise
and it's Hungary
between monarchy and aristocracy. The Hungarian king lost his powers to an aristocracy that drove the kingdom off the cliff. There are more examples than merely this one as well. In 1573, while Europe was swamped in religious intolerance and wars, the Warsaw Confederation was signed in Poland. A constitution that, besides limiting the power of the king and empowering the aristocracy, also made the king an elected office and granted unparalleled religious freedoms to those residing within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Historians have pointed out the similarities between the Warsaw Confederation and the American Constitution.
At school in the UK, the Romans are basically the beginning of history on the British Isles, as no real writing before that, and people thought it was a land of myths. That makes sense. A lot of reference in this video. True. Hola, señor. Hello, Fritos. How are you?
A century ahead of its time. But similar to Hungary, what happened was that the Polish aristocracy used their privileges to empower themselves at the expense of everyone else and weakened the central state. The Polish king became a puppet of the Polish aristocracy, and the aristocracy became corruptible to foreign influences, which helped amplify the collapse of Poland into foreign rule. The mistake made by Whig history is to view political developments from an entirely idealistic lens. The Hungarian aristocracy did not try to limit the power of the king for the humanistic benefit of all the subjects of the king, or because some ancient liberalism before liberalism. Neither did the English aristocracy.
True, you're 100% right. Yeah.
Forerunners of a humanist struggle for freedom, they merely wanted the freedom to exploit the peasantry without interference or taxation by the king. Institutions are inherently conservative. Once established, those who establish them or work within them have an invested interest in preserving the continuation of said institutions.
Have we done any videos on Prussia?
Can come to the detriment of others.
Not many.
The preservation of such an institution is more often than not motivated out of a genuine belief in the wider.
Yeah, a big difference between England and Hungary is that England is an island, can be crushed by neighbors as easily when it doesn't have a strong king. True. Hungary does not have that advantage. England was isolated on an island with smaller Celtic states on its borders, versus Hungary being nearby Russia, Turkey, Holy Roman Empire.
The benefit of
that's true. That's a huge difference.
To preserve the structures,
which is practically what happened, right? Ottomans invaded, the Mongols invaded, and Habsburgs. You would later the Holy Roman Empire, and Hungary would always be at an influence from another foreign power. Well, not always,
an example
but a lot of times.
Is the rise and fall of the Republic of Venice and the Venetian trade empire. Venice was a proto-republic. It gained its independence in 810.
I love a lot of these smaller Italian states.
Out of the Dark Ages, and trade became more viable and lucrative again as a result. Being situated around islands in the middle of the Mediterranean, the Venetians were, as a seafaring people, put in an almost ideal position to conduct trade across the ocean. By the 14th century, Venice had grown to a population of 100,000, one of the largest cities in Europe, if not even the largest, the capital of all European trade. trade. The rise to this prominent position was spectacular and built upon innovations in commerce, specifically the commenda. The commenda was a contractual trade agreement that was signed between two people. The wealthier partner provided the capital, and the other would travel with the capital to get the merchandise to assure the success of the trade. The profits of these ventures were then split between the two contract partners. In some ways, this was an early form of stock investment, and in Venice it became the primary means of social mobility. While the rest of Europe was spending its time in feudalism with strictly enforced and unmovable social roles, any Venetian could sign such an agreement to then acquire capital through trade. In all medieval city-states, it was the wealthy merchants who ruled the cities. These usually governed through elected early parliaments, into which the merchants elected representatives too. And what makes Venice so unique is that we see through the documentation of those representatives that more and more wealthy families of merchants continued to be established throughout the centuries. Basically, the open and inclusive economy created a social mobility that didn't exist anywhere else in Europe. Parallel to this, the political institutions of Venice were further expanded through the creation of a council of merchant representatives meant to limit the power of the elected ruler of the city, who was called the Doge.
Wait, what? There's a big Chile country ball, but it's not a country ball, it's just a thing, like a worm.
The ministerial council of magistrate representatives and a council of aristocrats who picked and nominated candidates for the office of Doge. This furthered the creation of additional political development through the creation of magistrates, bankruptcy laws, appellant courts, and the legally binding private contract. The private contract, in many ways, is a Venetian invention. These political innovations...
Because Chile is long, I'll guess, yeah, true. Elden Ring reference. I don't really play Elden Ring, so I think I
its power in the 14th century,
really missed
Venice
that reference,
was a city-state with both inclusive economic and political institutions. From here on, Venice began to decline. And a key factor in that decline was the economic process of creative destruction. The social mobility guaranteed through commercial activity meant that the political and economic power of ruling families declined.
In Poland Ball comics, Kazakhstan is a brick. Yeah, I think I've seen the Kazakhstani bricks,
political tensions started to emerge. Established city elites no longer wanted to share power with or accept upcoming new wealthy Venetian families. They disliked the competition. So they expanded their powers of their own councils and introduced a police force to crack down on political dissent. By the early 1300s, political inclusivity had been stamped out, and with political power now closed within a limited and non-inclusive elite, these newly established Venetian oligarchs banned the commenda. The mechanisms of economic inclusivity were thereby destroyed. In the following decades, the Venetian oligarchy nationalized the trading companies.
Yeah, exactly. What made Venice wealthy at the beginning was now basically gone, because the aristocracy got greedy, they got jealous, I guess, of newcomers. Venice also had the disadvantage that the New World became more important in trade, and Venice was locked out of the Atlantic by Spain. True, and I was actually going to make a comment about this because what he mentioned at the beginning of this segment, talking about Venice, was that rich people would sort of not sponsor, but give money to explorers to trade, and then they would split the earnings, right? I think it works a little bit similar when talking about exploring the New World, right? Portugal, the wealthy aristocracy or wealthy people in general would sponsor the exploration trips first to Africa, then to the New World and India. And that's how the system began. So I don't know if maybe Portugal either copied this, Portugal and Spain would copy this from Venice, or it would be different because these trips were to explore, not really to trade. But yeah, either way, the New World would become important, and Venice was just a lock in the Adriatic Sea and the Mediterranean, and that's it.
Venice, effectively seizing complete
Real Life Lore made a new video available on Nebula. True, really? I'm gonna watch it. I can't transmit Nebula on the stream, but or can I? I don't know. I don't think so.
From here onward, Venice declined in power, wealth, and population.
And England?
Throughout the coming centuries, while the populations of other European cities expanded, Venice was the only one that had a declining population. Stagnation and decay took hold, and Venice was reduced to little more than a plaything of other European powers. The established
And
wealthy
Austria.
and powerful families of Venice didn't wish to share the institutions of wealth and power with up-and-coming families who used mechanisms of social and economic mobility to gain wealth and power. So, they destroyed the mechanisms of social and economic mobility to preserve their own institutions of power. However, thereby dooming Venice to stagnation, lack of innovation, decline, and eventually subjugation and conquest by foreign powers. What many advocates of Whig history often forget is that the people many consider to be the founding fathers of liberalism were keenly aware of the danger presented by the institution of free commerce to generate oligarchic structures that consequently undermined those very institutions. John Locke, for example, demanded that there should be a maximum income, that the unbridled hoarding of wealth represented a danger to the Commonwealth, and that therefore, at a certain point of high income, the Commonwealth ought to step in and cap and take the earnings of an individual that are deemed too much to be necessary for living and business. In 1778, the American founding father John Adams...
John Adams, my guy. You should react to Canadiana. It's probably one of the most underrated channels on here and one of the best. I'll check it out, brother. YouTube would probably not mind you reacting to Nebula, but the content creators definitely will if they notice you. Yeah, maybe I could try once, but yeah, I don't want this particular stream taken down, so not
the
gonna risk it.
aristocracy is always more sagacious than an assembly of the people collectively, or by representation, and sooner or later proves an overmatch in policy. It is always more cunning too than a first magistrate, and always makes of him a mere ceremony, unless he makes an alliance with the people to support him against it. What is the whole history of wars in Europe but one demonstration of this truth? The standing armies of Europe were all given to kings by the people, to defend them against aristocracies.
Damn.
Adams is a founding father who is widely associated with elitism and centralized federal government, together with Madison, who wrote in the federal papers,
"It is of great importance in a republic not only to guard society against the oppression of its rulers, but to guard one part of society against the injustice of the other part. Different interests necessarily exist in different classes of citizen. In a society under
Interesting,
the forms of which
considering
the stronger
everything that's
faction
going on
can
in
readily
America.
unite and oppress the weaker, anarchy may as truly be said to reign as in a state of nature, where the weaker individual is not secured against the violence of the stronger."
Both Adams and James Madison were known to have been in conflict with Jefferson.
Yeah,
who
don't risk
envisioned
it.
the United States to
Could
become a
always just
society
block out the
of
visual
honest
part,
and
though. Not
independent
everyone
small
here has
business
Nebula.
owners, craftsmen, artisans, and traders.
It'd
and
be cool,
farmers
though,
like
but I
himself,
really
who ran
just
and
don't want to risk it.
regulated the economy by themselves for themselves. Jefferson's vision won when he beat John Adams in the presidential election of 1800, but Jefferson's dream was killed during the American industrialization of the 1860s to 1920s. That time period is today often romantically misrepresented by American libertarians as the American Golden Age. While it is true that it was a golden age of business in America, it was also the golden age of American corruption and business criminality. Unrestrained by economic regulation, what began to emerge in the 1870s were increasingly powerful corporations.
Exactly, yeah, because a lot of, Carnegie and the steel companies and, I think the Rockefellers came late with the oil empire, right? The oil oligarchy in the U.S. But you still had like this big, huge corporations that were monopolies. I think were monopolies. And people like Teddy Roosevelt will try to break those corporations because they were so massive. And again, I know that Carnegie from either steel or railroads, I don't remember what he did, and the Rockefellers, which is why the U.S. was a republic and not a democracy, true.
Increasingly monopolized their markets and strangled competition. One of the earliest examples of such is a group of men called the Associates, who founded the Pacific Railroad Company. They sold stock for a company that didn't even exist, used that money to get Leland Stanford elected governor of California, thereby guaranteeing that the California government would give preferential treatment to their company, and then just flat out bribed members of the US Congress into giving them access to 9 million acres of land to build the Pacific stretch of the Transcontinental Railroad. None of these people had any experience in building railroads. 3 of them were just failed miners and failed businessmen. A physical company in terms of laborers and a supply chain for the materials needed didn't even exist. Yet, the US government gave them $100 million, agreed to give them $16,000 per mile of railroad built on flat land, $32,000 per mile on hills, and $48,000 per mile over mountains. They then bribed the government
That's a lot of money,
to write a report concluding that the lands around Sacramento, which are literally called the Flatlands, was nothing but hills and mountains, and started building their railroad there. The entire thing was a scam. The railroads were built snaking around in weird paths to make sure that as much money as possible came their way for every mile the Congress paid for. They went to the various towns on the route to make them compete in who could offer the largest bribe, or else the railroad would not go through their town. They bought up the coal mines that supplied them, but hid that in shell companies and created a scheme where they mined coal for $2 a ton, then sold it back to themselves for $6 a ton, and used the government's contract to reimburse them the remaining $4 per ton. By the time they met the Union Pacific Company route, both companies deliberately built tracks avoiding each other side by side so they could squeeze more money out of the Congress, until Congress noticed and forced them to meet and connect tracks. Once finished, the railroad executives abused their economic power, holding a monopoly over railroad transport out of the West. They hiked transport costs and fees for any goods leaving places like Arizona, Wyoming, Utah, or Nevada, unless the goods belonged to companies they owned or had partnerships with, making the entire region economically dependent upon their goods.
The USA has automatically banned you for having no money,
You
Lamau.
couldn't be elected governor or a congressman or even just run a successful business exporting any goods if you were not on good terms with, or in the pocket of, or had been bribed by the railroad executives. And this, in case you're wondering, is one of the main reasons why places like Arizona were economically underdeveloped and in some parts impoverished way up into the 1950s. None of the men known as the Associates had innovated or invented anything. None of them had any experience successfully running a business. In fact, most of them were failed businessmen. By any modern standards, frankly, they were con men. But these men, who made their fortunes in the 1860s, would become a more common occurrence in the United States in the decades to come, be it in oil, steel, or banking, or tobacco. The by and large almost completely unregulated market of the 19th century United States produced a set of ruthless
monopolies,
who amassed an incredible amount of wealth and used that wealth to undermine the market for competitors and gain political power. The common term used in that time for these men was robber baron. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who monopolized railroad and steamship transportation throughout the US East and openly bragged that his economic power translated into substantial political power. John D. Rockefeller, who ruthlessly eliminated any competition to his oil businesses and managed to gain control over 88% of the United States oil industry. John Pierpont Morgan, the founder
J.P. Morgan, yeah, of course,
J.P. Morgan, who monopolized the US steel industry together with Andrew Carnegie.
Andrew Carnegie,
Rogers, an employee of Rockefeller who founded Anaconda Copper and monopolized copper mining. Or John C. Osgood, who sold his coal mining corporation to Rockefeller and is notorious for having pressured the Colorado government into sending the National Guard against striking miners and pressuring state legislators to criminalize strikes. By the 1890s, 70% of the US economy was owned by just a handful of corporations, owned by just a handful of very rich men who became the world's first billionaires. By all standards, this is what is called an oligarchy. For some legal and public relations crafty work, their corporations became known as trusts. Yet, the year 1890 is also when the golden age of the robber barons started coming to an end, with the passing of the Sherman Antitrust Act that prohibited the forming of business cartels that undermined competition.
Business cartels?
Saw the four antitrust presidents, movements such as the Farmers' Antitrust Movement and Progressive Movement, and journalists like Ida Tarbell, who ended that era.
So let's see, who were the presidents?
Antitrust presidents.
We've got Teddy Roosevelt, Taft, Woodrow Wilson, surprisingly, and FDR.
Movements such as the Farmers'
It makes sense. Yeah, they were all
progressive movement,
fairly progressive,
like
except for
Tarbell,
Woodrow Wilson, really.
That era. Roosevelt used the Sherman Act to break up the interests of J.P. Morgan and bring suits against the American Tobacco Company and Rockefeller Standard Oil. His successor, William Taft, broke up Standard Oil and introduced the federal income tax. Wilson passed the Clayton Act and created the Federal Trade Commission with the stated purpose of preventing the establishment of monopolies. He in fact warned,
If monopoly exists, monopoly will always sit at the helm of government.
Wow.
I do not expect monopoly to restrain itself.
Yeah, and he was right.
Further strengthened the antitrust laws and introduced financial regulation to contain the buildup of monopolies. Farmers' movements, such as the one known as the Grangers, started
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, being progressive back then was very different from what it means today.
elections throughout the Midwest in protest against exploitative business practices and tariffs set on interstate commerce by the various transportation monopolies. The biggest achievement came in 1887 with the Interstate Commerce Act, which is basically the starting point of where federal government regulation of US commerce began. While journalists such as Ida Tarbell published investigative pieces, like the famous The History of the Standard Oil Company, which helped turn public opinion against the trusts. In contrast to our times, in which giant corporations are seen as too big to fail, the prevailing attitude from the 1890s to the 1930s was that corporations could become too big to be allowed to exist. Civil society regarded them as a threat to economic and also to civil liberties, and therefore threw their weight behind legislation.
Okay, so a lot of corporations now are deemed too big to fail in the sense, and I think, and if you guys know more about this, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but they are deemed too big to fail because, well, they shouldn't fail, because when someone, let's say, Morgan Stanley, what was the company that failed in 2008? Was it Lehman Brothers in the United States that caused the whole economic crisis in 2008? I forgot the mortgage, the subprime mortgage crisis. It causes sort of a domino effect. When a huge company fails, a bunch of other companies start failing. People lose their jobs, they can't pay their bills, and it just becomes a huge crisis. So,
legislation to limit their growth and power. There are two main points I would like you to consider
I guess,
and discuss from
well,
this video.
let's hear.
First, Whig history is bunk. The idea that there is a natural path or progression of humanity or a specific peoples into liberal democracy or liberty is simply not true. As we have seen with the examples of Hungary and Venice, political structures that grant liberties can just as well be hijacked by forces that will abuse these powers to undermine those liberties for others. As tempting as it may be to see the history of humanity as a process of political progression, this is simply not the case. Liberties are far more fragile than many may first assume, and a society does not naturally progress into liberty through fulfilling certain stages in political development. Second, economic liberty is no guarantor of political liberty. As we saw in the example of Venice, where social mobility and political rights of participation were deeply tied to economic status and wealth, monopolies can still be formed to undermine what is seen as competition, both in economy and political. The example of the 19th century United States clearly outlines how unrestrained markets can create economic power structures that not only threaten economic liberty, but civil liberties. In a time in which open markets to countries like China and Saudi Arabia have failed to produce any substantial civil liberties in those places, and when the world's largest businesses are considered to be too big to fail, it may be worth remembering that the United States underwent a period in its political development of breaking up monopoly to guarantee market freedom and civil liberties. At the end of this video, I wanted to thank you, especially the patrons and channel members, for your patience. 2 months ago, I had an accident with a deep fryer that left me with some rather big oil burns covering much of my right arm and my chest. The injuries left me in a position where I couldn't work for more than a month, and is the reason why most of the artwork in this video was not drawn by me. I am very grateful to the artists I hired for drawing 90% of this video while I was recovering. And just as my burns finally started to heal, I caught a really nasty case of COVID and also had to deal with some unfortunate private issues. In total, I must have lost around 2 months worth of work time, and I'm very grateful to all of you for not losing your patience with me and giving me the time to get through this mess while I couldn't work on a video. I'm hoping to get right back into the normal schedule of work and to bring a new video for you very soon. And finally, I wanted to give a special shout out and thank you to the Korean artist Teabag. Teabag has been one of the best artists I have hired for more than a year to draw art for many of my videos. He has not just been a great artist, but also a great teacher, giving me tips on how to draw and become a better artist myself.
Cute.
You probably noticed how my art style...
The artwork in this video were very, very good. Yeah, true. Basically, Singapore in a nutshell, economic delivery without political delivery. True. The way Singapore works is just very weird. True, excellent art. Yeah, it was amazing. That explains it. Actually, I saw him on Twitter talking about him being behind schedule. I think I saw it on Instagram. You know, I follow Kraut on Instagram, and I think I saw when he caught COVID, you know, and I was like, okay, his video is going to be late.
Over the course of the videos I made. Teabag received a letter from the Korean government recently informing him that he was going to get drafted into the Korean military to do his 2 years of mandatory service. As such, I have to say goodbye and thank you. When you come back in 2 years and want to do some drawing work again, we will be open for you and waiting for you. And yes, that's a we, not just me, because it's not just me saying thank you and wishing you all the best, but everyone in our small little group of creators and friends that formed over the last 2 years.
Hey, Teabag, I just wanted to say a few things before you do go into
No,
the
and
military.
even
And
us.
I just want to wish you all the best. You've been a great friend for the past 18 months or so since I've known you, and I know it's probably going to be tough for you. And I just want to let you know that a lot of us are going to miss you in this period, but we are certainly looking forward to speaking to you once you're finally out of service on the other side. Take care, Teabag. I'm sure you'll be fine, and I can't wait to speak to you again one day, my friend.
Thank you for all your hard work, and I wish you all the best.
Okay, so this is like a message of all the...
Hey, Teabag, it's me, Flying Tongue.
So yeah, this is just a huge message for the guy. Okay, well. I mean, that's nice. That's wholesome, right? Can't blame the guy for... I mean, going 2 years for a military service, and it sounds pretty strict because, again, he's going to be far away from his computer, so that sounds... pretty horrible. I mean, Korea, well, I mean, it makes sense, right? It's South Korea, come on. But damn, this video was pretty good. Sort of a history of liberal history. What do you guys think? Yeah, rough. Oof. Guys, like, I can't imagine doing 2 years of a very strict, hardcore military. Because there is, I guess it's technically mandatory military service in Mexico, but there are ways around it, you know. I personally didn't do my military service. Sorry, government, you know, sorry, CIA. Well, it's not the CIA because it's in Mexico, but